I sighed as I hung up the phone, the words of my daughter-in-law, Loralee, still ringing in my ears. "Don't forget to bring an appropriate gift this year," she had said, her voice laced with thinly veiled condescension. Layla was so disappointed last time. The audacity of that woman never ceased to amaze me. She had invited me to my own granddaughter's 10th birthday party, only to remind me of my apparent failure the previous year. I could feel the anger simmering within me, but I refused to let her get under my skin. Not this time. "Who was that, dear?" my husband Ned asked, entering the living room with a cup of coffee in hand. "Loralee," I said, unable to hide the disdain in my tone. "Inviting us to Layla's birthday party, but not without a jab about last year's gift." Ned shook his head, his brow furrowed in concern. "She's at it again, isn't she? Trying to make you feel inadequate." I nodded, my jaw clenched. Oh, I see right through her game. This year, I'm going to uncover what she's really after. Ned placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Just don't let her get to you, Marcella. We'll get through this like we always do." But as I looked into his eyes, I knew this time was different. Loralee had crossed a line, and I was determined to expose her true intentions, whatever they might be. The day of the party arrived, and as Ned and I approached Loralee's lavish home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. We were greeted at the door by Loralee herself, her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate makeup masking the venom that lurked beneath. "So glad you could make it," she said, her tone saccharine sweet. "Come on in." We followed her into the house, where the party was in full swing. Children ran about, their laughter filling the air, while parents mingled and sipped drinks. But as we made our way through the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were outsiders in our own family's celebration. Loralee flitted from guest to guest, her charm on full display. But whenever she caught my eye, there was a hint of smugness, a subtle reminder of her perceived superiority. As the party progressed, Loralee gathered everyone around for the gift-opening ceremony. One by one, Layla tore through the expertly wrapped packages, each gift more extravagant than the last. And then she reached our modest offering, a beautifully illustrated book that Ned and I had carefully selected, knowing our granddaughter's love for reading. Loralee's eyes narrowed ever so slightly as Layla unwrapped our gift, and I could sense the disapproval radiating from her. In that moment, I knew that this was about more than just gifts. This was a power play, a twisted game that Loralee was determined to win. But as I watched Layla's face light up with genuine joy at our thoughtful present, I realized that I had all the ammunition I needed. Loralee's true colors were starting to show, and I was ready to fight back. As the party wore on, the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. Loralee's fake smile never faltered, but the daggers she shot my way spoke volumes about her true feelings. "Marcella, dear, why don't you help me in the kitchen?" she called out, her voice sickly sweet. I could use an extra pair of hands. I knew better than to refuse, so I followed her into the spacious kitchen, bracing myself for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. As soon as we were out of earshot, Loralee whirled around, her mask of charm melting away to reveal the ugly truth beneath. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," she hissed, her eyes narrowed to slits, "but you'd better watch yourself." "Game?" I replied, feigning innocence. "I'm simply here to celebrate my granddaughter's birthday." Loralee let out a derisive snort. "Don't play dumb with me, Marcella. I know you're just waiting for an opportunity to undermine me in front of Lyle and the rest of the family." Keith, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her accusation. "Undermine you? Loralee, you're the one who can't seem to let go of whatever petty grudge you're holding against me." Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment I thought she might lash out physically. But then, as quickly as the storm had brewed, it passed, and a sly grin spread across her lips. "You know, Marcella, I almost feel sorry for you," she said, her voice dripping with false pity. "You try so hard to be the perfect grandmother, but it's just not in your nature." With that, she turned and sauntered back into the living room, leaving me seething in her wake. It was clear that this was about more than just pettiness or one-upmanship. Loralee had a deep-seated resentment towards me, and she was determined to make me pay for some perceived slight. But I wasn't about to back down. Not this time. As the party continued, I kept a watchful eye on Loralee, observing her every move. every interaction. And sure enough, she didn't disappoint. When it came time to open Layla's gifts, Lorelei made a grand spectacle of presenting her with the latest and most expensive gadget on the market. Layla's eyes lit up with childlike glee, and for a moment, even I was impressed by Lorelei's generosity. But then she turned to me, her lips curled into a condescending smirk. "I hope you don't mind, Marcella," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "but I wanted to make sure Layla got something truly special this year." The jab was clear, and it took every ounce of self-control I had not to lash out right then and there. Instead, I forced a smile and thanked her for her thoughtfulness. But as I watched Layla's face fall ever so slightly as she opened our more modest gift, I knew that Lorelei had won this round. She had managed to make me feel small, inadequate, in front of my own granddaughter. It was a low blow, but one that only strengthened my resolve. If Lorelei wanted to play dirty, then so be it, but I would be the one to have the last laugh. As the party drew to a close, I found myself wandering away from the crowd, seeking a moment of solitude to collect my thoughts. That's when I overheard a conversation that would confirm my worst suspicions about Lorelei. "Did you see the look on Marcella's face when I gave Layla that new tablet?" Lorelei's voice rang out, laced with a smug satisfaction. "Priceless." I peered around the corner and spotted her huddled with a group of her friends, sipping cocktails and giggling like schoolgirls. "She's just so pathetic, trying to keep up appearances with those lame gifts," Lorelei continued, her words like venom. "It's almost embarrassing, really." My heart sank as I listened to her spew her vitriol, tearing me down with such casual cruelty. But what stung even more was the realization that this wasn't just about gifts or one-upmanship. This was about money, status, and Lorelei's desperate need to feel superior. "You know, I almost feel sorry for Lyle," one of her friends chimed in, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Having to deal with that family and all their baggage? It must be a nightmare." Lorelei scoffed, taking a sip of her drink. "Please, Lyle knows better than to question me. He's just happy I've brought a little class and sophistication into his life." The group erupted into laughter, and I felt my blood boil. How dare she speak about my son, my family, with such disdain? The gloves were off now, and I was determined to expose Lorelei for the manipulative, money-hungry snake that she was. As I stormed away from the gathering, my mind raced with possibilities. I knew I couldn't confront Lorelei directly. She was too skilled at playing the victim, too adept at twisting the narrative to suit her needs. No, I needed to go about this more strategically, to gather evidence of her true nature and present it in a way that even Lyle couldn't ignore. That's when I remembered an old friend from my days as a librarian, a retired police officer turned private investigator. If anyone could help me uncover the truth about Lorelei, it was him. The next day, I wasted no time in giving him a call, and within hours, we were sitting across from each other in his dimly lit office. "So, what's this all about, Marcella?" he asked, his voice gruff but laced with concern. I took a deep breath and laid out the situation, sparing no detail about Lorelei's manipulative behavior and my growing suspicions about her true motives. He listened intently, nodding along as I spoke, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "You know, Marcella, I've seen this kind of thing before," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a steely resolve. "Women like your daughter-in-law, they're masters of deception, but they always leave a trail." A glimmer of hope flickered within me, and I leaned forward, eager to hear his plan. "Leave it to me," he said, offering me a reassuring smile. "We're going to get to the bottom of this, and when we do, we're going to make sure your son sees the truth." As I left his office, I felt a sense of determination wash over me. The wheels were in motion, and for the first time, I had an ally in my quest to unmask Lorelei's true nature. She may have thought she was in control, but little did she know that her reign of terror was about to come crashing down around her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of covert operations and clandestine meetings. My private investigator friend, Jake, had proven to be a godsend, tapping into his vast network of contacts and resources to dig up every last shred of information on Lorelei, and what he uncovered was more shocking than I could have ever imagined. "Marcella, we need to talk," he said grimly, beckoning me into his office one afternoon. I settled into the worn leather chair across from his desk, my heart already racing with anticipation. "What did you find?" I asked, unable to mask the urgency in my voice. Jake leaned back, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's bad, Marcella, real bad." He slid a thick manila folder across the desk, and I eagerly flipped it open, my eyes widening as I scanned the contents. "Lorelei has been living a double life," Jake explained, his voice grave. "On the surface, she's the picture of suburban perfection, the doting wife, the loving mother, but underneath, she's been hiding a dark secret." I felt my stomach churn as the pieces started to fall into place. "She's a gambler," Jake continued, his jaw clenched, "a big-time gambler, with debts piling up faster than she can keep track of." My mind raced back to all the lavish gifts, the designer clothes, the flashy cars, all of it a facade, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of wealth and status. "That's not all," Jake added, his brow furrowed with concern. "We've got evidence that she's been pawning off those fancy gifts, using the money to feed her habit." I felt a sick sense of vindication wash over me. All this time, Lorelei had been mocking me for my modest offerings, when in reality she was the one selling off her own material possessions to fund her addiction. "So, what do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and determination. Jake leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. "We catch her in the act," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "And when we do, we make sure your son sees the truth for himself." Over the next few days, Jake and I hatched an intricate plan, a sting operation of sorts designed to lure Lorelei into revealing her true colors once and for all. The opportunity presented itself a few weeks later, when Lyle's birthday rolled around. Ned and I had decided to go all out, purchasing an exquisite piece of artwork that we knew Lorelei would be unable to resist pawning off. As we presented the gift to her, I watched her face carefully, noting the brief flicker of greed that flashed across her features before she composed herself and gushed with false gratitude. Little did she know that Jake and his team were already on her trail, tracking her every move as she inevitably made her way to the nearest pawn shop. And sure enough, like clockwork, the call came in. Lorelei had taken the bait, and she was in the process of selling off our gift for a fraction of its worth. With the evidence in hand, Jake and I wasted no time in setting up a family dinner, inviting Lyle and Lorelei under the guise of a casual get-together. As we sat around the table, the tension in the air was palpable. Lorelei played the part of the dutiful wife flawlessly, regaling us with stories of her latest charity endeavors and Layla's academic achievements. But then, just as dessert was being served, Jake burst through the door, a grim expression etched onto his weathered face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice booming through the stunned silence, "but I'm afraid we have some unfinished business to attend to." Lorelei's eyes grew wide with panic as Jake produced the damning evidence, photographs, financial records, even a signed pawn slip bearing her name. "Care to explain this, Lorelei?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. For a moment, Lorelei remained frozen, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before our very eyes. And then, just as quickly, she sprang into action, her lips curling into a snarl as she lashed out with a torrent of excuses and denials. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. As Lyle sat in stunned silence, his face drained of color, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. After all this time, after all the mind games and manipulation, justice was finally being served. And as I watched Lorelei unravel her true colors on full display, I knew that the battle had been won. The mask had slipped, and there was no putting it back on. In the aftermath of Jake's bombshell revelation, the air was thick with tension and disbelief. Lorelei, her carefully crafted facade now in tatters, was a sight to behold. Her eyes wild, her perfectly coiffed hair disheveled as she scrambled for an explanation. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling with panic. "I can explain everything." But Lyle wasn't having it. His face was a mask of hurt and betrayal as he turned to face his wife, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and utter disbelief. "Explain what, Lorelei?" he spat, his hands clenched into tight fists. "How you've been lying to me this whole time? How you've been gambling away our money? Our future?" Laurelie's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But no words came out. It was as if her silver tongue had finally failed her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable for the first time in her life. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction watching her squirm under the weight of her own deceit. For far too long she had played her games, manipulating and belittling me at every turn. But now the tables had turned, and she was the one left grasping for control. "Lyle, please," she pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. "You have to believe me. It wasn't supposed to get this far." But Lyle was having none of it. He turned to Jake, his eyes steely with resolve. "What else have you got?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And so Jake laid it all out. The financial records, the paper trail of debts and unpaid loans, the sordid details of Laurelie's gambling addiction, and the lengths she had gone to feed it. With each new revelation, Laurelie's composure crumbled a little more, until finally she was reduced to a sobbing, sniveling mess, her once perfect facade reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. "I'm sorry," she wailed, her words punctuated by heaving sobs. "I'm so sorry." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Lyle was too far gone, too consumed by the weight of her betrayal to offer any semblance of forgiveness. As the tension reached a fever pitch, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of triumph. This was what I had been waiting for, the moment when Lorelai's true colors were laid bare for all to see, when the mask she had so carefully crafted was torn away, leaving nothing but the ugly truth behind. But even as I basked in the sweet taste of victory, a part of me couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the broken woman before me. She was a shell of her former self, a cautionary tale of what happens when greed and addiction take hold. And yet, as I watched her crumble, I knew that this was the only path forward. For too long she had held us all in the palm of her hand, playing her twisted games and reveling in her perceived power. But now, the scales had tipped, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. As Lyle rose from the table, his face a mask of grim determination, I knew that the battle had been won. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. "I'm sorry, Laurelie," he said, his voice heavy with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "But this is over. It's time for you to get help." And with those words, the curtain fell on Lorelai's reign of terror, leaving only a trail of broken promises and shattered illusions in its wake. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion and upheaval. Lauralie had been forced to come clean about the full extent of her gambling addiction and the mountain of debt she had amassed. It was a bitter pill for Lyle to swallow, but deep down I knew he had been harboring suspicions of his own. As the family rallied around him, offering support and guidance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Finally, the truth had been laid bare, and Laurelie's carefully constructed facade had come crumbling down around her. But as much as I wanted to revel in her downfall, a part of me couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the woman. After all, addiction is a powerful force, one that can consume even the strongest of wills. Still, that didn't excuse her behavior. The lies, the manipulation, the utter disregard for the well-being of her own family. And so, as Lyle and Lauralie worked to pick up the pieces and chart a path forward, I found myself torn between a desire for justice and a reluctant sense of compassion. It all came to a head one evening, as we gathered for a family dinner. The tension in the air was palpable, each of us struggling to find the right words to address the elephant in the room. Finally, it was Lyle who broke the silence. "I know this hasn't been easy for any of us," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "but we need to figure out where we go from here." Lauralie sat beside him, her eyes downcast, her once vibrant spirit seemingly extinguished. "I've agreed to seek help," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Counseling, support groups, whatever it takes to get me back on track." I couldn't help but feel a flicker of skepticism. After all, how many times had we heard these promises before, only to be met with more lies and deception? But then I caught a glimpse of Lyle's expression, a mix of hope and determination, and I knew that, for better or worse, he was committed to this path. "We're behind you, both of you," Ned spoke up, his voice steady and reassuring. "Whatever you need, we're here to support you." I nodded in agreement, but deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that clouded my thoughts. Could Lorelai really change? Or was this just another act, another carefully choreographed performance designed to lull us into a false sense of security? As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to more practical matters: the financial fallout, the need for transparency, and the steps that would be taken to ensure Lorelai's recovery. Throughout it all, I couldn't help but watch her closely, studying her every move, every facial expression for any sign of deception. But to my surprise, she seemed different, humbled, almost, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. And then, as we were preparing to leave, she pulled me aside, her eyes brimming with tears. "Marcella," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I've made mistakes, more than my fair share. And I know that I've hurt you, in ways that can never be undone." I held her gaze, my expression guarded, waiting for the inevitable catch. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to making things right," she continued. "For Lyle, for Layla, and for myself. I know it's going to take time, and I know that I've got a long road ahead of me, but I'm ready to face it head on, no matter what it takes." In that moment, as I looked into her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen before. A glimmer of sincerity, a hint of the person she might have been before her demons took hold. And so, despite my reservations, I found myself nodding, offering her a tentative smile. "I believe you," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue, "and we'll be here, every step of the way." As we parted ways that evening, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, redemption was within reach. In the weeks that followed, the reality of Lorelai's betrayal began to sink in for Lyle. As the full scope of her gambling addiction and the financial ruin she had wrought came to light, a palpable tension settled over our once happy family gatherings. Lyle, who had always been the peacekeeper, the one to smooth over any familial rifts, now found himself at the center of a storm he never could have anticipated. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now carried a haunted, hollow expression, a constant reminder of the trust that had been shattered. Lorelai, for her part, seemed to be making a concerted effort to own up to her mistakes. She attended counseling sessions religiously, participated in support groups, and even took a part-time job to start chipping away at the mountain of debt she had accumulated. But despite her outward displays of contrition, I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that lurked in the back of my mind. After all, hadn't she played this game before? Hadn't she mastered the art of deception, of weaving intricate webs of lies and manipulations? Ned, ever the voice of reason, urged me to give her a chance, to put aside my doubts and offer her the support she so desperately needed. But as much as I tried, I couldn't bring myself to fully trust her again. The tension came to a head one evening as we gathered for a family dinner. Lorelai had been regaling us with tales of her newfound commitment to recovery, her voice dripping with forced enthusiasm. "I'm feeling really good about this," she proclaimed, her eyes darting around the table seeking validation. "Like I finally turned a corner, you know?" Lyle offered her a tight-lipped smile, his expression a mix of hope and thinly veiled skepticism. "That's great, honey," he said, his voice strained. "I'm proud of the progress you've made." But as the conversation continued, I couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in Lorelai's demeanor. The way her gaze would linger just a little too long on the expensive decor, the way her fingers would fidget nervously whenever the topic of money came up. It was as if her addiction, her insatiable hunger for more, was never truly far from the surface. Finally, unable to contain my doubts any longer, I spoke up. "Lorelai," I began, my voice steady despite the tempest raging within me, "I want to believe that you're sincere about this. Really, I do. But I can't shake the feeling that there's still something you're not telling us." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on me as I laid my reservations bare. Lorelai's face contorted into a mask of indignation. Her lips pursed tightly as she struggled to maintain her composure. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "After everything I've been through, after all the work I've put in, you still can't bring yourself to trust me?" Lyle placed a hand on her arm, his expression pleading for calm, but she brushed him off, her eyes locked on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You want the truth, Marcella, she spat, her words laced with bitter resentment. The truth is, I've been living a lie for years, a lie that you and your precious family helped create. My heart pounded in my chest as she continued her tirade, each word like a slap across the face. You all looked down on me from the moment I married Lyle, she raged, her voice rising to a fevered pitch. You saw me as some kind of gold-digging trophy wife, someone who could never be good enough for your precious son. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she laid bare the deep-seated insecurities that had fueled her downward spiral. So, yeah, I turned to gambling, to shopping, to any vice that could help me feel like I belonged, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Because no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I gave or how much I sacrificed, it was never enough for you. As her words hung heavy in the air, I found myself at a loss, torn between a desire to comfort her and a deep-seated resentment that had taken root over years of hurt and mistrust. But before I could muster a response, Lyle spoke up, his voice trembling with a combination of anger and heartbreak. Enough, he said, his eyes boring into Lorelei with an intensity I had never seen before. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep making excuses for you, justifying your actions and pretending like everything's going to be okay. Lorelei's eyes widened, her mouth agape as she realized the gravity of what was unfolding. Lyle, please, she begged, her facade crumbling before our very eyes. I'm trying, I swear. Just give me another chance. But Lyle just shook his head, his expression hardening with a resolve I had never witnessed before. I'm sorry, Lorelei, he said, his voice heavy with finality. But this has gone on long enough. I can't keep living like this, constantly wondering when the next lie, the next betrayal, is going to come. As Lorelei dissolved into a sobbing mess, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of vindication. For too long she had held us all hostage with her manipulations, her insecurities poisoning our once happy family. But in that moment, as I watched her world crumble around her, I knew that the cycle had finally been broken. The masks had been torn away, the lies exposed for all to see, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. And as painful as it was to witness, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. A hope that, in the ashes of Lorelei's downfall, we might finally find the path to healing and redemption we had been seeking all along. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotion, as our family grappled with the fallout of Lorelei's actions and Lyle's ultimatum. There were tears, heated arguments, and more than a few sleepless nights, as we all struggled to come to terms with the reality of the situation. Through it all, Lorelei remained a fixture in our lives, a constant reminder of the pain and betrayal we had endured, but also a glimmer of hope that redemption might still be possible. It was during one of our weekly family dinners that the breakthrough finally came. The tension in the air was thick as usual, with everyone carefully sidestepping the elephant in the room. But then Lorelei spoke up, her voice trembling with a vulnerability I had never heard from her before. I know I've put you all through hell, she began, her eyes downcast as she struggled to find the right words. And I know that sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. Lyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched as he braced himself for whatever was to come. But I want you to know that I'm committed to getting better, Lorelei continued, her gaze finally meeting ours. I've been attending counseling sessions twice a week, and I've joined a support group for gambling addicts. A flicker of surprise rippled across Ned's face, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. It's not going to be easy, and I know that I've got a long road ahead of me, she admitted, her voice tinged with a rare humility. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right, for Lyle, for Layla, and for all of you. There was a moment of silence as her words hung in the air, each of us processing the weight of her promises. It was Lyle who finally broke the tension, his expression a mix of hope and cautious skepticism. I want to believe you, Lorelei, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you have to understand how hard it is for me to trust you right now. Lorelei nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And I don't expect you to just forgive and forget. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove myself, to show you that I'm serious about turning my life around. As Lyle considered her words, I found myself torn between my lingering resentment and a reluctant sense of empathy. After all, hadn't we all made mistakes in our lives? Hadn't we all stumbled and fallen, only to pick ourselves back up and vow to do better? It was Ned who finally broke the silence, his voice steady and resolute. I think we owe it to ourselves and to Layla to at least give Lorelai a chance, he said, his eyes meeting mine with a silent plea for understanding. I took a deep breath, willing myself to push past the anger and hurt that still simmered within me. You're right, I conceded, my voice barely above a whisper. We've all made mistakes, and if Lorelai is truly committed to getting better, then we should support her. Lorelai's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope flickering across her features as she realized the weight of our words. Thank you, she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. From that moment on, a tentative truce settled over our family. It wasn't perfect, by any means. There were still moments of tension, flashes of resentment that threatened to derail our fragile progress. But through it all, we clung to the belief that redemption was possible, that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and effort. Lorelai threw herself into her recovery with a fervor I had never seen before. She attended meetings religiously, made amends where she could, and even took on a part-time job to start chipping away at the mountain of debt she had accumulated. Slowly but surely, the walls of mistrust that had been erected began to crumble, replaced by a cautious sense of hope and understanding. It wasn't an easy road by any means. There were setbacks and moments of doubt along the way. But through it all, we remained steadfast in our commitment to one another, and to the belief that our family was worth fighting for. As the months passed, I found myself watching Lorelai's transformation with a mixture of awe and cautious optimism. The woman who had once been consumed by greed and insecurity was slowly giving way to someone new, someone more grounded, more appreciative of the things that truly mattered. And as I watched her interact with Layla, the love and genuine affection she showed our granddaughter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, we had finally found our way back from the brink. It wasn't a perfect ending, by any means. The scars of her betrayal would always linger, a reminder of the pain we had endured. But as I looked around at my family, at the bond that had been forged through fire and struggle, I knew that we had emerged stronger, more resilient, and infinitely more appreciative of the precious gift that was our love for one another. And in that moment, I realized that true redemption wasn't about absolving oneself of past sins. It was about facing them head-on, owning up to your mistakes, and committing yourself to being a better person, one day at a time. It was a lesson hard learned, but one that would stay with me for the rest of my days. A reminder that even in our darkest moments there is always hope, and that the path to healing begins with the courage to take that first, tentative step forward.